Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my co-host, political scientist Trey Orndorff. How you doing today, Trey?
It's wonderful to be back with you, specifically, Michael.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've done a show together. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
So, you want to get us started off?
Yeah, why don't we start off talking about the big North and South Korean meeting
Yeah.
this past week? This is interesting. I think we'll probably spend a few minutes on it, but I really pretty much agree. The New York Times basically summed this up as being short on details, long on theater. And I think that's absolutely right. There's this really interesting moments. We have all these great pictures. We have the border handshake. But kind of beyond that, what do you think about what has actually come out of the meetings specifically?
Yeah, I agree with you. Not a whole lot. I think, didn't President Trump tweet something about the Korean War being over or something like that? Jumping the gun just a tiny bit. And I think there seems to be, well, at least in some quarters, expectations that I think are a bit too high given what we know about Kim and given what we know about North Korea's history of breaking many agreements. So I'm a little concerned about that. And, I've heard that there's already some suggestion that China is loosening up its enforcement of sanctions based on what Kim has done recently. And if you're being cynical and trying to understand North Korea in light of what we already have seen in terms of their actions in the past decades, it's like, well, you would understandably think that this is a cynical ploy to kind of get the sanctions loosened a little bit so they can kind of keep on doing what they're doing. So, I mean, I'm all for friendship and Kim and Moon, stepping over the border and doing the hokey pokey in the DMZ or whatever it is. But I'll believe it when I see it. And again, I think that denuclearization means something very different to Kim than it does to Moon, than it does to Trump and a lot of other folks. But yeah, it's certainly a step in the right direction. But let's not be overly optimistic. The other point I'd make is that it's understandable to me that a lot of people in South Korea are being so optimistic or so hopeful about this, because you think about it, Seoul is a city of over 10 million people, and it's only around 35 miles from the border there. And so, they know that in the event of some sort of military action, that would just be absolutely devastating. And so, of course, they want the best possible outcome. And so I get that, but I just don't trust. I just don't trust Kim. I just don't trust North Korea. And I hope I'm wrong about this.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's wonderful that you get two big policy platforms coming out of here. You get that, as you had noted, you get that complete, quote, complete denuclearization, end quote. But of course, the devil's always in the details. And we get the framework for a potential peace between North and South. And that's wonderful. But there's nothing behind that yet. What I will say though is that I don't want it to sound like I'm not I don't want to speak for you, Michael, but I don't want to sound like a cynic in the sense that I'm sad that we're having a meeting or that these two sides have decided to choreograph what's happening here. I mean, I see that as a positive stride. I mean, but as you're noting, does that actually mean as this moves forward that we're going to see the things that one might assume these words mean or not?
Right.
And I think that's a different question. So, you don't want to say boo completely to the spectacle of it all because you have to have that before you can have anything else. But, expectations
Yep.
need to be tempered.
Yeah. In terms of how we got to this point, there are some people, some Trump supporters especially, saying that this maximum pressure strategy of the president is what's responsible for this. And there are others saying that it's Kim who's just very confident and now in having a solid nuclear capability. And, I think there might be some truth to both of those things. And I certainly don't say a lot of positive things about President Trump. But I think in this case, those sanctions, especially getting China to go along to the extent that they did for a while, have really potentially had some bite. And that, you can look at that and say, well, maybe that's a somewhat of a foreign policy victory for the president. Though, on the other hand, I would say, given all the nuclear testing that North Korea has done, would any other American president have done differently. Well, I don't know, maybe Bernie Sanders would have. I'm not really sure, but I know I think that Hillary Clinton presidency we would have seen very similar sort of overtures. But of course, that's obviously a big hypothetical. So I will give the president. I think he is that pressure has really helped. But again, I think it's also that now that Kim knows that he has nuclear weapons that can do some damage, that's a big part of it as well.
Well, and the other thing that's really interesting is Chinese scientists have their hypothesis is basically that the test sites have been burned out, that they can't be used anymore. And so this is a
Right.
time for a potential switch. So you've got to have a pause anyway. I mean, again, I'm not trying to say that has to be the only cause. But you're talking about the Trump variable. It's just really these kinds of things are really difficult to tease out when you want to say, well, which variable affected this and how much did it affect it? Is a
Yep.
difficult task in the best of circumstances, and in this kind of this far removed from it, it's very difficult.
Yeah, and as President Reagan famously said, trust but verify, and
Yeah.
so I think the verification part of it's going to be incredibly difficult in such a closed and paranoid society like that of North Korea. So, but we of course all hope for the best.
Agreed, agreed. Well, now kind of moving towards more domestic and a longer term ally, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, visited, and we had a bit of what some are calling the bromance between him and, and
Yeah.
Donald Trump. I mean, anytime you get to talk about the meaning of the word dandruff in the New York Times and the
Oh God.
Washington Post, right? But anyway, we're going to put those things aside, of course. But what's really interesting that's happening here is we have Macron coming, and on the one hand, we have a man who is positioning himself to be, I think, very close to Trump personally, while at the same time trying to kind of push policies that contradict the major policies of Trump. I mean, clearly he is trying to have Trump reconsider his position on Syria. He is clearly trying to reconsider his position on steel tariffs, which includes the EU. And of course, the thing that he's going to come back to in his address, the issue with the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And so, what's really fascinating to me is when you're looking at this, you have Macron trying to, on the one hand, say, Trump and I are close as people. We get along. We understand each other. We're strong leaders in that sense. Uh, but on the other hand, he wants to kind of bend Trump on some of his major foreign policy positions. What do you think about that, Michael?
Well, yeah, I agree entirely. As you point out, there are these four key issues: tariffs, Iran, Syria, and the Paris Accord. And when we take a look at these issues, sort of taking these apart, we can see that there is an awful lot of distance. I think, especially uh, President Trump is the most, I'd call him strident even on trade. On May 1st, those tariffs are supposed to kick in at 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum. And currently the EU has an exemption, but that's only until May 1st. And my understanding is that, and understandably so, is that the EU does not want to commit to the voluntary limits on exports that the administration is asking for in order to continue that exemption. And we've talked about trade before, and you as a libertarian, and I agree with you on this, that these trade these tariff battles are just not a good thing for anyone really, except for one tiny little segment of the American economy, but it hurts more than it helps. And that's truly unfortunate. And I know you agree with me on the trade issue, certainly.
Oh, for sure. And I think the problem with these trade issues is that the people, and as a matter of fact, Ken and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. The problem with them is that they help and hurt very small but very visible populations of people, where the benefits, while huge, are more dispersed. And so you get into you have trouble. And I think this is a problem that Macron faces with Trump. He's got to convince him that this less easily understood, diffused good is better than this very concentrated, you can kind of put your finger on it, but minimal issue. And I mean, what do you think about that when it comes
Well,
to the, I mean,
yeah, I agree. I also think there's this issue. The president seems to be fixated on this idea of trade deficits. And he has this idea in his head, at least certainly for public consumption, that a trade deficit is a bad thing, full stop. And the bigger it is, the worse it is. But
Hmm.
yet, I mean, that's an incredibly oversimplified way of looking at it because there are so many things that go into this. Of course, there's trade in goods, then there's trade in services, where the U.S. tends to run a little bit of a surplus. Then there's what happens to this money, this trade deficit money, and a lot of this money from foreign countries gets reinvested in the United States and creates those jobs that the president, and understandably, is so interested in seeing created. And then there's also the fact that the United States is full of a lot more spenders than a lot of countries like Germany, for instance, where, there's much more of a culture of savings. And all of these things go into that. And when you ask economists, and this is both on the right and the left, they're almost invariably, they will say, trade deficits are not that big of a deal, are not the indicator you really want to look at in terms of economic health. And yet the president has just fixated on this. And again, it's one of these things where I don't know if it's a case of whether or not he just doesn't understand how international trade and international economics works, or if he just doesn't care and he's just saying something that he knows not to be true to appeal to a certain audience. I guess in a sense it doesn't really matter because we end up with the same result. But clearly this is something that's a lot more harmful than it is helpful. And unfortunately, I think because the story that the president is telling about this is so simple and clear, but also so wrong, that it appeals to a lot of Americans who don't understand that this actually is not in our best economic interest.
Well, and it goes back to economic policy. I mean, the story of protectionism is an easy one, and it fits in
Yeah.
with the national identity that Trump wants to hit, which is another fascinating juxtaposition with Macron, right? I mean, he's pushing in Congress, and he says, "Look, we don't want to have America first. You need to kind of move beyond the narrow borders of nationalism," which, by the way, is a little fascinating from the country that invented it. But, um, but nevertheless, we'll take him as it is right now. And but it is interesting because those things go together. This idea that as money flows out, you're losing strength, you're losing power, you're losing identity. And I think it's more about that than it actually is the economic policy. I mean, I think if we
Yeah.
could have Trump on the show, I don't think that he'd be like, whatever the economists are going to say, like, forget them. The thing that matters is that when you have this deficit from his point of view, you're losing your power, you're losing your identity, you're losing who you are, and that's more important probably in his mind than these little economic things that'll
Yeah.
work themselves out as the time goes on. Now, I think that's a wrong-headed view, but I think you can't take away Trump's view of the trade deficit from his view of America first.
No, I agree entirely. I think that's a great point. Kind of added to that, I also think that this is just another example of the president seeing almost everything as a zero sum game. That we can't all win. We can't design a system that is good for everyone. There have to be winners and losers, and certainly internationally, I'd argue in many domestic policies as well. But it comes out most intensely in his views on trade and his views on America's place in the world and so forth. And that's really unfortunate because certainly there are some instances where these things are zero sum games, but not always. And trade is, I think, one of these examples where we clearly know that it's not a zero sum game. And, the president just doesn't seem to be willing to accept that.
It's just endearing to me, though, Michael, that you're going to agree with me on this so much because, like, you are the left perspective here, and you've just agreed with your liberty. I mean, I have nothing to disagree with you.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, some of my friends on the further left, like Bernie Sanders, for instance, would actually be more in line with the president on
Hmm.
that. Now, they would pitch it more in terms of we're all for free trade, but we want to see it to be fair trade and labor standards and other things like that. And that tends to apply obviously a lot more to trade with developing countries where safety and worker rights and all those sort of things aren't at the same level as they are in most of the EU countries and so forth. And that's a whole nother argument. Now, I would argue that you can make a case that yes, there need to be improvements in that. But if you take a look at what's happened in some of these developing countries, so many millions and hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people have been lifted out of abject poverty because of that, and that's I think a good thing. But that's a whole nother argument, certainly.
Right, because we're talking about the EU here. And one last point about this, the conversation going on here between Trump is the idea that we see Trump once again kind of delegitimizing the international organizations
Yeah,
that are supposed to take care of this, like the
yeah,
World Trade Organization, the WTO. I mean, one of the things I deeply agree with Macron on was he's like, look, commercial war is a problem, but if there's problems with it, we have institutions designed to deal with. I mean, that's why we created these treaty arrangements. That's why we create these international organizations. And when you see Trump and when the country then moves away from that, you end up giving them less power, and as a result, it makes it harder for them to do the things that we want them to do, which is to create a free trade system.
yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering, moving on to if we can move on to the Iran issue. Because there's a
Hmm.
deadline with that as well. That May 12th is the next recertification deadline for the Iran deal. And it seemed to me initially that the reporting, at least, was that Macron thought that he could get President Trump to agree to, or at least informally agree to, recertify the agreement. But it seemed to me that by the time he left, he pretty much said, well, no, he's not going to do that. And it's
Hmm.
really now the issue is convincing the United States to not impose sanctions on EU companies that do business with Iran. So it's kind of the difference between pulling out of the deal and just saying, well, that's fine. We're not going to sanction other companies. We're just going to take care of our own companies, focus on that, and actually working to destroy the deal. And we don't really know what the president's going to do with that. I would hope that he doesn't destroy the deal. You and I might have some disagreement there. I'm not really sure, but I've said from the beginning that I think that the Iran deal is a highly imperfect deal, certainly, and it could be improved. I think a system of deadlines, or sorry, of because right now there are these points at which Iran has agreed that it won't, have this material and won't have these centrifuges and that sort of thing. And these are kind of like set points. I think you could make it sort of a rolling type of thing where we could agree that, well, if they want the sanctions to stay off, then they have to push back this deadline and so forth. I would be for something like that, but it seems to me that the president just wants out of it entirely, and I think that's a big problem. What do you think?
As a matter of fact, I agree with you on this one. I mean, one of the things that's going to make me different than some of our other conservative commentators like Jay is because I take a more libertarian point of view. I'm gonna be far less hawkish, for if your listeners are wondering, than your average conservative is. And it's interesting because I think what we were just talking about a few minutes ago about North Korea is a comparable instance here for Iran, in the sense that in general, I believe that the evidence suggests that having increased ties with a country is what is going to give you the best opportunity to moderate the negative effects of the things that they
Yeah.
want to do. So
Hmm.
if you want to have more peace with the country, if you want them to not be playing fast and loose with, fissionable material, or
Yeah.
nuclear material, then what you need to be doing is trying to increase your ties with that country. I mean, again, take a look at North Korea, one of the most
Hmm.
isolated countries in the world, and this
Absolutely.
and this is where we have the bulk of our problems. So if you want Iran to be a bigger problem, well, then it's difficult to say. We mentioned a minute ago, what variable is going to be a big deal. Well, isolate them, and then they're going to want to do a lot of crazy things,
Yeah.
or at least they won't care, because what's it going to matter? So
Yeah.
my suggestion is, I agree, the Iran deal, is it a great deal? No, but it's a deal. And it's something that creates connections, it creates economic connections, and anything that moves you in that direction is going to increase their connection to the rest of the world. And as a result, they're not going
Yeah.
to want to blow it up.
Yep. Well, let me ask you then, and that kind of leads into, I think, a perfect lead in. We did not plan this, to a third point of, I guess you call it conflict, is the Paris Climate Accord. Now, President Trump, announced a while ago, announced the U.S. withdrawal from that. Now, that withdrawal won't be complete until 2020. It's just a phased thing, and so to me, it's not an utter disaster necessarily, assuming what I hope happens in November of 2020 actually does happen. But I certainly saw it as a setback. But to me, that would be my argument for staying in, saying, well, it's important to the fact that the United States is the only country that is not part of this agreement. Certainly an imperfect agreement, absolutely. But of course, it's not binding in any way. And so the idea of being part of the international community, working to improve these ties and improve this agreement, that's what I think is important. And yet I think it's another example of President Trump playing to his base and not really buying into multilateralism, and you talked before about how, he doesn't necessarily like these international institutions and so forth, and he'd rather deal bilaterally with countries. And that's just clearly not how the world works anymore. And I think it's for the better, because the more intertwined we are diplomatically and economically, the less likely we are to have these huge problems that we've seen again and again and again.
Yeah, you don't shoot at people that provide your bread. I mean,
Right.
it's that simple. Now, specifically about the Paris Accords, I will say that when you actually take a look at the Accords, I mean, this is all about rhetoric, and I don't know, I'm not sure if you agree with this or not, but when you take, like, say, for instance, China promises, because basically each country in the Accords gets to promise whatever the heck they want to promise,
Yeah.
and then they say, we're going to meet whatever it was we said we were going to meet. So in the case of China, for example, they said that they're going to have a plateau at 2025, I believe, for their admissions. That's where it's going to get the top. Well, what's really fascinating about that is a couple of years ago, we've been studying that. And do you know when we think they were going to plateau? Long before anybody thought about the Paris climate. 2025.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Yeah.
So I
We
think
promised to do what we were already doing,
we
but
probably,
that's my point. It's such a, maybe innocuous is the wrong word, but exactly your point. So it's an agreement that doesn't really bind us to anything. We can pledge whatever we want, essentially. It's so,
why pull
that to
out?
me
Yeah.
was just so ridiculous to pull
Well,
out of that. And to me, it's just the most kind of craven playing to the political base.
Well, I mean, in all honesty, isn't that really what, in some ways, this was either direction? I mean, you had look, we're gonna take positive steps to reduce climate change by doing nothing absolutely differently, on the one hand, but we're gonna say that we have this accord, which, I mean, again, I'm not. I mean, just to be clear for our listeners, right? Because I know that all of us have slightly different positions, right? I think that it is very scientifically evident that we are experiencing man-made climate change, right? So just hear that as I'm making this argument here. But that doesn't mean
You're
that
no Scott Pruitt.
yeah, exactly. I am no Scott Pruitt. Please elect me to the EPA, or nominate me to the EPA. As a matter of fact, I mean, I think shortly that job is going to be open. So I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. So if Donald Trump listens to us after Fox and Friends, Trey Orndorff
There you
for
go.
EPA. But so that is very much real in the case, but that doesn't mean that I think that the accord will get us any closer. However, and this is where I agree with you, Michael, uh, this is all just a matter of winning or losing votes. Democrats like it and want to stay in the accord because they want to be viewed as doing something positive toward climate change that requires absolutely nothing. And Trump, even though being in it doesn't matter one iota, along with Republicans, want to get out of it because they don't think climate change matters. So you get this complete, it's a complete position taking. That's all it is.
And it's that same sort of zero sum game type of mentality. It's very similar to what I was talking about a little bit earlier. And that, again, it's this dichotomy between jobs and climate, right, and the environment. And that's, I mean, in some cases there are certain trade-offs that have to be made, yeah, but that's not necessarily the case. There are ways to design policies where it's not such a stark zero-sum type of thing. A while ago, and this was quite a while ago, I talked to former Colorado Governor Bill Ritter about this on the show. I had him on the show, and he pointed out it doesn't have to be that way, certainly. And China is making some huge investments in clean energy technology. And my concern is that if we keep our head in the sand on this, is that China is going to essentially, in the zero sum terms, win the future on this, and we want to be part of that future. And so that's a big concern to me.
No, I agree. But just in terms of the visit with the Accord, I mean, this is just position taking. So I mean, I
Yeah.
agree with you long term, but on this particular issue, I see it just as being a position taking between the two presidents.
What do you think in terms of Syria? Because that's certainly an interest of France and France, and they talked about that a lot. And my sense of things is that there maybe is some room for persuasion agreement on Syria. Of course, President Trump, said that he wanted to pull out our remaining troops, but and France is, I think, a bit against that. And there are a lot of weird alliances and so forth in there. I mean, Iran there comes back in again because they're a major ally of Syria, and then Israel comes in there because they don't really like Iran for obvious reasons. They want
And
to
then
destroy Israel
Russia.
as a state, and Trump is clearly no fan of Iran, and is no fan of the man he calls Animal Assad. So, I mean, I think that there's certainly some room to perhaps convince the president that we need to keep an American presence in there. And certainly that's the view in the EU, is that the United States is critical to maintaining some semblance of, I guess you could say, order, because we've seen, and I think to me it's fairly clear that as we have withdrawn from this, Russia jumped into this vacuum and now is a major player in a way that it wasn't 5, 10 years ago. And I think, given what we know about Russia and Vladimir Putin, that's an awful development. And that's exactly why, a lot of people say, well, why is the United States so involved in the world and we spend so much money on defense? This is why, because when we pull out into this vacuum, all sorts of bad stuff happens. And so we can't just pull out and just say, well, let's just hope for the best and let them take care of their own problems in America first. That's just not how it works.
It's funny. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago on the show, and it was interesting because we kind of had to flop of positions, and maybe we'll do it again here. This is one of the few times when I actually, in principle at least, agree with the president. I'm not sure what continued American involvement in foreign expeditions like Syria will net us. I mean, I agree with you that it's not great that Russia's being, but in the same way that Russia failed to have much success on any kind of metric you want to have when it came to Afghanistan, and then we come in and we have the same kind of failure of success. I think the problem is there isn't always a clear idea of, well, what is the goal? What are we attempting to achieve besides some keep the Russians out or
Yeah.
keep the Iranians out? From my point of view, trying to be the police of horrible situations is a long-term failure unless you're trying to very specifically do something that's actionable. Now, now, of course, here's where I'm going to disagree with Republicans and Trump. I think the best way you can fix some of these things is by having more, easier, better immigration policies. But that's not exactly the
Yeah.
topic here. So,
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I understand what you're saying. We do disagree on it. I mean, my feeling is that from the beginning in Syria, our problem, and this is what just I hate, is that we have this sort of presence that just really doesn't do much. I mean, I think there's something to be said for the kind of go big or go home type of argument, where we do just enough to say that, well, we're sort of kind of doing something, and there are a few missile strikes here and there, but it doesn't do much. I mean, we're spending money and time and resources, but not enough to make any kind of a difference. And so my feeling is that if we want to commit to a region, we should commit to a region. And so right now, I think we have a few thousand troops in Syria. We've lobbed a few missiles in there and so
mhm.
forth. And to me, that's the worst of all worlds, essentially. If we want to, I think from the beginning, we should have committed to coming in on the side of the rebels. And I know that that was a super complex thing, but I mean, the Syria situation is a huge mess, just in terms of figuring out who all the players are. So I'm not downplaying how difficult that would be to do, but I think we sort of walk on eggshells around some of these things when sometimes what's called for is just, look at what Russia did. They said, okay, we're going to go all in on this and we are going to be allies with Assad and provide all this support and do all this stuff. That's the kind of thing that is effective. And I think that we didn't do that. And I think that's, I'm not necessarily calling for, maybe I am kind of calling for an expand. Yes, in fact, I am calling for an expanded U.S. role in Syria. I kind of convinced myself in my argument there. So yes, that's what I am in fact calling for. I agree with our European allies that we need more of a role there.
Well, see now, but that is at least. I mean, at that point, you're going to be having some very measurable outcomes. Okay, we want to defeat the reigning government in Syria, right? I mean, that's a sustainable, potentially goal. I mean, we might disagree whether we should do it or not, but that's a goal at least. I'll agree with you
Yeah.
on that front. But that's going to require saying, look, it's time to kill Assad and everybody who had anything to do with Assad.
Yeah.
And I don't think neither the Obama administration nor the Trump administration has wanted to take that position for a variety of reasons. And given that I don't think that either a Democrat or a Republican president is going to take that position, and I don't think there's the will in Congress to do it, then I mean, as you rightfully point out, what is the point of lobbying
Exactly. So,
you?
yeah.
So
So in that case, that's where you and I do agree, because
yes.
this sort of kind of kind of half, what sort of policy doesn't really achieve much. So yeah, we do agree on that at least.
Well, I think that we've kind of exhausted. I mean, we've gone from every possible issue that they've discussed. Maybe we should move
Absolutely.
back domestically again and talk a little bit about the Arizona special election,
Yeah.
which is very fascinating, I think. I mean, so one of the things, and I don't know if you had noticed this, Michael, but as this week has been going on and prior weeks, it has been fascinating to me how this election has gotten a ton of coverage, and yet how little time was actually spent on the candidates themselves.
Yeah.
If you actually take a look at the major stories from all the major news outlets, you will not find the candidates' names, but in a few of them, which
Hmm.
I think
Yep.
is fascinating. So just listeners, if you're interested, you got Debbie Lesko as the Republican, and I'm going to butcher this. Can you pronounce the Democratic name?
I'm gonna let you. I'm gonna let you give it a shot, Trey. Go ahead.
Tipernini?
That might be. I listen to so little news on TV that oftentimes with names, it's like, well, I don't know. I'm going to give this a shot and so forth. But
You know,
but I think let's go with that. So,
I
yeah.
listened to a number of pronunciations yesterday, and I just kept thinking, "Am I going to get this out?" Am I? So, by the way, I just want to apologize to her if I butchered your name. I have worked on this, so just a heads up.
Maybe I should. Maybe we should listen to Fox and Friends more often or something. Get more information on this.
Well,
I don't
this
know.
week we probably should have. I mean, they
Yeah,
had a really
exactly.
fascinating guest who they
Interesting
had to cut
call in.
off.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. So, but
it was my
anyway.
crazy uncle, I think.
But I think that's a great point you make about the candidates, and to me, it actually makes a certain amount of sense because in so many respects, this was such a vanilla type of race. I mean, neither of the candidates were weird or extreme or anything like that. No Roy Moorish type of stuff, and this was a pretty typical deep red congressional district, and that
hmm
to me is what makes this so interesting.
Yeah,
And if you look at the spending, the campaign spending from the campaigns themselves was just about the same, but outside spending there was a big difference. On
huge.
the conservative side, it was just short of 1.3 million. On the liberal side, just over 300,000. So, so $1 million advantage to Lesko, and yet, in a district that Trump carried by more than 20 points in 2016, the Republican sort of ekes out a victory under all those circumstances. And that's the sort of thing that even had, a lot of Republicans saying, holy cow, we need to do something because we can't just say that this is some kind of weird sort of unusual thing and we had a bad candidate or they had a good candidate. This is a pretty typical type of congressional race. And so understandably, when you look at all of the races that have been all the special elections, Democrats are outperforming their the kind of standard projections by an average of 17 points.
Hmm.
And that's freaked out a lot of Republicans. Now, there are some Republicans who I think are sort of whistling past the graveyard saying, well, yeah, but the generic ballot only has Democrats up by around 7 points or so. That's true. But people don't vote on the generic ballot. They vote on actual candidates. And so if I'm the RNCC, I'm pretty concerned about this. And also should point out that Democrats have been raising money at a better clip, I believe, than Republicans as well. So, again, given again the fact that in typical midterm elections, the party in power loses a bunch of seats,
Hmm.
this is something for Republicans to be concerned about, I think.
Well, I mean, I agree to a point.
Okay.
However, the thing that I want to highlight here is that as political scientists, I think most of us are going to suggest that the actual process of campaigning an election, is not one of the major
Absolutely. Yeah.
contributors to the outcome. And so I think those larger variables suggest this. So when you're looking at this, if you're a Republican, don't get me wrong, there are some problems in the Republican Party. However, I think Democrats need to be careful when they're looking at these numbers to say how much of this would have happened anyway, given the structural variables of being the party that's in power,
Good
the
point.
party that
Yeah.
has the president. And then you also have to ask yourselves in these kinds of special elections, well, what's the kind of person who's turning out for the special election? In this election, we only had 173,708 votes. Well, that's not going to be your typical voting sample size when it comes to the general election either. So again, this does not let, as you put it, Republicans can't just whistle past the graveyard. They have to take this seriously. However, Democrats would do well to pay attention to the political science on this and recognize that they were already in a good position. And I don't mean that it's not a shot, that's not a bad thing. It's just the truth that these larger structural variables were favoring them. And then they have to go from there to say, well, how much more of this is due to Trump's Republican Party?
Right. If you're going to be super cynical about this, you would say, well, maybe this is some plot by Republicans to act all super concerned and give Democrats this feeling of complacency. Like, for instance, I don't know, during the 2016 presidential election, where so many people just assumed, and I was one of them who said, oh, please, God, let Donald Trump be the nominee, and Hillary Clinton will, as much as I have issues with her, will waltz into the presidency. And boy, that didn't quite turn out. So yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's hard to not focus on campaigns because that's what
Yeah.
I mean. Every news story is about the minutia of the campaign,
Hmm.
as if that's what happens. But when you take a look at the actual numbers, persuasion that's what generally people are thinking about when they're thinking about a campaign. They're thinking, you're persuading people to vote one way or the other. It is almost a zero. Okay.
Yeah.
And again, I mean, I know we agree on this because this is established. I mean, maybe not everybody
Yeah.
agrees with it. Established science. We'll get to that in a minute. But for the bulk of us, we're going to agree with this. And so, but it's really hard for the average viewer to
Sure.
not think, hey, oh my goodness, it has everything to do with what this candidate said this week. It had everything to do with their position to Trump. Those things have bearing, but they don't
Yeah.
have the bearing that I think the average person has to say. And I think that's this story has been wrongly framed. Is my point. And again, that's not a pass. Don't hear me right. I'm not saying that means that Republicans are a-okay, but it means that when you're analyzing this, you have to be careful to not go, see, this proves it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and of course, the fact that, if you just look at the political science, the research, the political science literature would say that, well, Democrats have a strong probability of regaining control of the House just based on what we know about midterm elections
Hmm.
in general. And so that would go to the argument that Republicans should be concerned, but not because of bad campaigns or the Trump effect, but just because of what happens typically in midterm elections.
Which is why they do need to be worried because they have an uphill battle, right? They
Yeah.
should be recognizing, wait a second, even if we had, Jesus as the next as our president right now, we're still facing a trouble.
I think
Um,
Jesus would be above 40% in approval, but I don't know.
that's a fascinating question, and I dare not even hypothesize on that because then somebody's gonna like poke us on Facebook.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
um, so I believe the next. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to talk about the special election?
No, I'm interested in moving on to nominees and all kinds of fun about that. So I think that's our next story, isn't it?
It is indeed Ronnie Jackson. Dr. Jackson, the White House's top physician, he pulled out of the nomination really before it even completely got started. After it was his nomination was going, or I should say, his hearings were going to be postponed due to just a continued number of accusations that included him being junk on the job, handing out prescription drugs, and creating a hostile work environment. Now, it's interesting, though, in his comments, because these have not come out formally. We don't know what this comes from. It's all kind of behind the scenes. But he argues that, look, if they had any merit, I wouldn't have been selected and promoted. This is a quote from him, and entrusted to service in such a sensitive, important role as a physician to 3 presidents over the past 12 years. And so it's interesting, so you have Jackson saying, look, I'm going to pull out because this isn't working for the role, but I'm not saying that these accusations are in any way true. And we haven't even been into the bulk of it. So much of this is just kind of behind the scenes. So what do you think about all of this, Michael?
To me, this is a sad commentary on how American politics works these days. I agree in a sense with Jackson in that these stories now. At least how I interpret these stories, with the giving out prescription drugs, my understanding was basically like, oh, you're having trouble sleeping, here's an Ambien. And that's like so not a big deal. The drunk on the job, if you have been paying attention to what happens on some of these presidential trips, it sounds like the Secret Service for years has been like this kind of essentially a presidential protection fraternity where they have these wild keggers and do all this stuff with hookers and other stuff, and there's huge issues there. But again, this to me, it was not the issue. I don't think that Jackson is some horrible person or anything like that, and it never should have been the issue. The fact that it came to this, the issue to me is, here is a man who was nominated to run the second largest agency in the federal government. Not only that, but an agency that's in huge crisis by many accounts, that has a man who has no managerial experience at that kind of level. That to me is the issue. And the secondary issue is that this was just somebody who the president apparently said, oh, I like him. He's a good guy and he's a doctor. And so, okay, he could run the VA. Like, are you kidding? No vetting, no coordination, these ill-timed, these ridiculous tweets. To me, this is, if I'm a conservative, and I'm not, this is what drives me crazy, because it's the president kind of shooting his own administration in the foot by not thinking these things through. You can't just have somebody with no experience really running the VA because he's a good guy. Now, maybe the president thinks that way because he feels like he's a good guy and he doesn't have any prior experience. And look, he's running the entire country, and aren't things going swell? I don't know. Maybe that's his thinking, but I just think if you're a conservative, you have to think, my God, what a bunch of wasted opportunities.
I agree. I in part agree with you, but I think that you're right. Is that none of that was the real reason that he gets torpedoed.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, as a result, all that has happened here is, instead of bringing an important issue to the fore, a guy who we have absolutely no evidence has done anything wrong just gets his name raked to the mud, so that we don't have a more difficult conversation about who should be and shouldn't be running the VA.
Yeah.
And I think that is, that's basically Congress and both parties falling down on their job to say, look, we know some of this stuff is boring. It's not particularly exciting to have, a conversation about managerial experience, right? It is not. It's never going to be prime time news, the way we do it right now. But that doesn't mean that that's not the thing. That's not the conversation that we ought to have had. And so we've actually, there's been a missed opportunity to talk about something that's important and meaningful. so that we could have kind of secondhand rumors about Dr. Jackson. And again, this is not, I'm not saying that he's right or he's wrong. I don't know. I have no way of knowing. But these kinds of secondhand rumors, that's not interesting.
Yeah.
That's nothing. We haven't even had the hearing. So to say that we now know something about him is ludicrous. I mean, that'd be like assuming you know something about me because some one random student whispered to their mom something and then you talk to the mom. Like, okay,
Yeah.
maybe, I don't know right? So I don't know.
And
I'm
to
just
me,
deeply
no,
disappointed with that process.
yeah. No, I absolutely agree. To me, it reminds me of that. I actually, this might sound, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I actually don't care if necessarily if he was drunk on duty, as long as he could do his job. It reminds me of that Abraham Lincoln quote. It's probably not actually something Lincoln said when, other generals, other folks were telling him that Grant was this big drunk. And he said, well, I wish you'd tell me the brand of whiskey he drinks. I'd like to send a barrel of it to my other generals, And
Yeah.
but the point being is what we should care about is competence and experience and so forth. And if you can do the job, assuming you're not, morally unfit, which is another issue, then that's what we want. We want the best person for the job. And the idea that Ronnie Jackson, whatever his character, whatever he did as White House physician, is the best person to run this agency, that's just ludicrous.
Well, and again, though, I mean, even if you want to say, hey, look, I think somebody who's a drunk, even if you want to take the stand that they shouldn't be doing this, we don't know any more about that now than we did
Exactly.
when this
Yeah.
process
Yeah.
started. And that's another problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what you're saying is if somebody potentially has a rumor about you drinking too much, that should be the thing that blows you up as opposed to the actual
Exactly.
problem.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
yes. Sounds like we agree. But now moving to a man whose character maybe more rightfully has been impugned recently,
Oh
Scott
yeah.
Pruitt. And there's kind of two things going on, listeners, with Scott Pruitt right now, who is the head of the EPA. One, obviously, he has had a number of potential ethical and financial problems, from flying first class so that he doesn't have to be with people who don't like him, to spending $43,000 on a privacy booth. By the way, it's always fascinating to me. That's like what I think intro level professors make at a lot of institutions. Anyway, just for his privacy booth. And we can go down a list. We won't do that right this second, but that's on one side. The other big interesting thing that has moved has been his now new rule to prohibit what is so-called quote unquote secret science.
Oh God. Yeah.
Now,
Exactly.
and I think we're going to probably spend some time on this, Michael, because I want to talk about
But
this
I
for a minute.
but I
Secret
want to
science,
say
that's just studies.
I
I'm sorry, go ahead. Go
no,
ahead.
I wanted to say I totally agree with you that these are separate issues, and I just wanted to point out that a lot of times people conflate these two things, and so I just wanted to, voice my agreement that these are two things that should be looked at separately.
Yes, for sure. Because the secret science, this is basically studies that make and use data that is kept confidential, generally for privacy reasons. Now, I recognize that not all of our listeners might know how the scientific process like works on the ground. So just a heads up, and I think both of us can speak to this. There are a number of kind of ethical obligations that researchers have to the participants in their studies. And especially when the more personal that becomes, the greater the onerous is on the researcher to ensure that there will be a protection of their human subjects. As a matter of fact, there are generally boards at colleges that review anytime you're going to have human subjects. And if you go to a certain level of invasiveness, one of the things that you have to guarantee is that data cannot be individualized onto certain people, and that there's even I mean, once upon a time, it'd be things like the information will be kept in locked cabinets and locked drawers. And today, different kinds of encryption requirements for these kinds of data. And effectively, this is what is at stake here with secret science, because what Scott Pruitt in this rule is arguing is that studies where you can't just grab every little bit of individualized patient data, if it's under confidentiality, can't be considered in EPA rulemaking. and
Yeah.
that's what the secret science is. Uh, and so, Michael, I mean, I have a lot to say, but I'm going to let you start. What do you think about it?
Well, I think certainly there's an important the transparency to the extent that we can do it with protecting people is very important, and I agree with to that extent. But I think that that's not really the intent of this, as you point for all the reasons you pointed out. And in fact, there were some internal memos that were released under a Freedom of Information Act request show that I think show fairly convincingly that the EPA, the top brass, their concern here was not really with sort of keeping science transparent, but with, I would argue, tilting the decks. In fact, some of these memos show that, well, how can we do this to not affect industry research? Because we want that in there, and we want to make sure that's not an issue, essentially. And so I think that's definitely just part of what we've seen with Scott Pruitt, who, made a career for himself in Oklahoma suing the EPA as is Oklahoma Attorney General there. And so I have a huge problem with this, and as do a lot of, there have been the Union of Concerned Scientists and other groups saying that we just can't, this just won't be workable in a sense. And in fact, this might not actually be legally okay because there are a number of congressional requirements saying that the EPA use the best available science in developing their rules. And so if this goes into effect after the 30-day comment period, which it almost certainly will, there will be lawsuits, and we'll kind of see how that works out. But I think this is a huge problem. And I should point out, it kind of, to me, goes along with this other sort of, well, we're trying to make this fair and impartial, just like that earlier decision by Pruitt that ruled that getting an EPA grant and serving on an EPA science advisory panel is a conflict of interest. Okay, maybe, but working for a state agency that sues the EPA or an industry being regulated by the EPA and also serving on an advisory panel, that isn't a conflict of interest. So if you're going to play this game, you need to actually be fair in this. And that's not what it's about. I mean, Scott Pruitt is interested in defanging the EPA, and that's what he's trying to do here.
Exactly. And he's doing it under the guise. I mean, again, even if you think the EPA is doing the wrong things, right? So just hear what I'm saying. It is wrong to go about it this way. Be
Yes.
straightforward. If you think the EPA needs to deregulate things, then deregulate them and just be open about that. But creating this quote unquote secret science ploy and to stigmatize people who are very conscientiously and with deep ethical implications keeping people's data private, which is what we'd want. I mean, imagine if I told you, hey, I'm going to release all of your health stats and that they're individualized to you. Or imagine if, I don't know if you've done some of these. I've done studies where you're looking at students' grades. Imagine if I said, well, yeah, this grade belonged to Susie Parker, and here's what she did the whole way, right? No one would think that that was okay, but you brand it secret science, and then suddenly it seems like they're doing sleazy things when really what they're doing, and that's what's so just horrendous here, is the exact opposite. It should be called privacy science, or it should be called ethical science.
Yeah. And, and certainly there are ways in certain instances where you can work around this, but a related concern is that if participants know that all of this will be publicly available, it might make it a lot more difficult. In fact, it almost certainly will make it a lot more difficult to recruit study participants, and that's a big deal. So, there were so many reasons to not do this. Another point I want to make is this idea of this being, just this kind of secret sort of, unverifiable thing. For science, for these sort of results to be published and get out there, they have to go through the scientific peer review process, which, is a hugely important part of what we do as, whether it's social scientists or medical scientists or what have you. And you and I are both familiar with that. And that's my problem with treating industry research as equal to this in the first place, because it doesn't have to go through this peer review process that academic research does. So, and that's something that's not really talked about. It's not just like somebody comes out with a study and here's a conflicting study from industry. That study that's published in the journal of whatever had to be reviewed by independent people who did not know who the original people working on it was and had to go through that process, which industry research doesn't have to. And I think that's hugely important.
It is. And as we take a look at, say, for instance, I know this is important to both of us, when we take a look at a lot of the studies that have been done on food, for example, we're seeing that industry research has been a crock in a number of,
Yeah,
and we
no,
have,
yeah.
as a matter of fact, in some cases, and this doesn't mean that every scientist is devoid of culpability. I mean, we've seen cases where obviously people in the sugar industry wanted to push the blame onto fat, a number of years ago. And so that is what means. So again, that may not seem like a big deal, but when you're trying to talk about, how should we make, the best possible rules? We can have a disagreement about whether we ought to make a rule or not. But if we've already agreed we're going to make a rule about something, then shouldn't we be using the absolute best data? And history suggests that industry data, you don't have to throw it out, but it needs to at least be placed in external context at a minimum.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, the other part of this, which I would agree is less important, Scott Pruitt testified before congressional committees and so forth, and I was, I could say, disappointed but not surprised to see him essentially blaming subordinates for
Hmm.
everything that happened. Well, I didn't know, I'm out of the loop, and but they did it, and not me. And I thought, wow, that's he's either lying or he's just a really bad manager for one thing. But he's this supposed fiscal conservative who seems to have no problem spending lavishly on the taxpayer's dime without a whole lot of oversight. And we've seen this again and again from Trump administration officials. And okay, to me, I think Pruitt's right. There's nothing illegal or criminal here. But certainly government officials, both liberal and conservative, have been forced out for far less. And that this Republican, to some Republican spin that this is all about his policy decisions and it's a witch hunt and so forth. Okay, sure. There was no way that liberals would be going after him as strongly if he were sort of a moderate type of person. But you can't just ignore this pattern of behavior. I wonder if maybe it's almost better for pro-environment forces like myself that Pruitt does seem so corrupt, which makes him seem a lot more legitimate. If I were President Trump, I might want to remove him and put in someone who would be just as anti EPA, but would be, not as at least seemingly corrupt. But I don't know. It doesn't seem. I know President Trump seems to like Scott Pruitt personally, like his kind of bombastic type of, take no prisoner sort of approach. But I would say that that's exactly the sort of thing you don't want when you're trying to enact what's a fairly radical deregulatory agenda.
And I agree. This is one of the things that just drives me sane as a fiscal conservative because both sides simply play the service charge of the money opposite directions. If this was reversed, Republicans would be out there talking about how this is the most horrible thing since the end of time, that he's spending $43,000 on a privacy balloon and hundreds of thousands of dollars on first class flights. And I mean, and I think that is a real policy issue. But what just tires me is that it never ends up being a real policy issue because both sides just brandish it around like a
Yeah.
weapon as opposed to having a consistent tact on this. So, just I can imagine the circumstance being reversed. And this is not me just trying to say, oh, well, Democrats do the same thing too. I'm just saying to when it comes to fiscal responsibility, that issue has become nothing more than a weapon of the moment. And when you get things like this, you just think, throw this guy out for no other reason than wasting all this money. I mean, I am a
Uh-huh.
fiscal conservative, but nobody is going to do that because this is just a torch that gets passed back and forth, and that one frustrates me to no end.
Oh, yeah. I totally agree.
So, well, I think is there anything else that we can say about
No,
Pruitt
I
that,
think that pretty much does it. Yeah, I think.
well, I think we both had some things we were reading that we wanted to recommend to listeners this week, Michael. So why don't you
Yeah.
get us started?
Well, I am, as I mentioned a few weeks ago to listeners, I read biographies before bed. It's just kind of a thing I fallen into doing. And my most recent one is a fascinating one, a figure that I've admired for a long time. H.L. Mencken. He's a Baltimore reporter, commentator in the early part of the 20th century. Just a great figure. He had a lot to say about, not too complimentary either, about democracy and politicians. One of my favorite quotes by him is, "I enjoy democracy immensely. It is incomparably idiotic and hence incomparably amusing." And he he was quite a character, just a sort of a hero of mine, actually, growing up. And the biography I'm reading of him right now is called Mencken, the American Iconoclast by Marion Elizabeth Rogers. And I would also recommend a book that Mencken himself wrote called Notes on Democracy, which is full of those sort of observations and so forth. He is just great fun to read. He's very anti-democracy. It's kind of refreshing in a way. Some people might find him overly cynical, but he's been a hero of mine for a long time, and I'm really enjoying that biography. So, what do you have, Trey?
That's so funny. I do a similar thing. It's one of the few times that I love my Kindle Paperwhite because everything
exactly.
can be off, and you can
Yeah.
be laying down. It's not so heavy. But it's funny. There has been a book on my list for a long time, and it's been more than a day. It's been a few weeks ago. Kindle, actually, they had for World Book Day. They had a bunch of books for free, and one of the ones was the one on my want to read by list. And you gotta love it when that happens.
Oh yeah.
It's called A River in Darkness: One Man's Escape from North Korea. And talk about the perfect time to have
Yeah. No kidding.
that book.
Wow.
It's actually, and again, speaking of butchering names, I'm going to try to do this the best I can. Ishikawa. He grows up, or is born, I should say, in Japan, and he is born to a Korean father and a Japanese mother. And his father has a very difficult life in Japan. It's kind of abusive, and so they're part of a group of individuals. Not a lot of people think about in history, who were quote unquote repatriated. In other words, they returned, even though they weren't originally from there, originally from South, returned to North Korea. And so his mom, who was Japanese, went with them as well, of course. And it's about both his going from Japan to North Korea as a young boy, then his life in North Korea, and which is a really fascinating inside story. But he would actually then eventually escape from North Korea later as an older adult, and it's both a fascinating tale about places you don't normally get an insight into, and also in a period in history I think that a lot of Americans don't know a lot about the details of, at least. And so it's been a really fascinating read, and anybody who would like to read something. Now, by the way, it's not like happy, so when you're going to bed, just be forewarned. But it is
Escape from North Korea does not exactly sound super happy.
Yeah, no, I mean there was no pictures, no handshakes for his escape. Just a heads up. But yeah, that's my recommendation for this.
That sounds great. Well, wow, we have come to the end of this just packed full to the brim episode. We got through an amazingly busy week.
Yes, we did.
Yes. Well, thanks everyone for listening. We do hope you liked what you heard. And of course, listener support is what allows us to do what we do every week. We truly do appreciate it. And so if you'd like to help us out, go to politicsguys.com/support. That's a direct link. Or you can just go to politicsguys.com and click on support in the main menu there. That would be great. Subscribing to the show also does help a lot, as does sharing episodes. So word of mouth, as always, is our best advertising. We really do appreciate it. As we also appreciate leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes. So if you want to get in touch with us, you can do that at mail@politicsguys.com. There's our Facebook page where you can message us and where we post stuff all week. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show is produced by Trey Orndorff. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.